Python frameworks and IDEs. In this final nugget of the series, we're going to take a look at the most popular web application frameworks for Python. As you know, in a previous nugget, we covered the mechanics of graphical user interfaces in desktop applications. Nowadays, especially in the 21st century, more and more applications are going out onto web servers or on cloud-based services. Therefore, as I said, I'm going to show you some of the major frameworks there. And also for your day-to-day Python development, although many folks are really old school and prefer to use Emacs or Vim along with the interpreter directly, an IDE or integrated development environment can go a long way as a learning tool for those of you who are just gaining your sea legs with Python and can present a great convenience for experienced Python developers. Let's get to work. There's a lot of good enlightenment to be had in this nugget. First, what are we talking about when we talk about web applications? Back in the old days, that is to say 10-15 years ago, a commercial website would consist of one or more static HTML pages. Nowadays, though, things have shifted quite a bit to where the front end, or the user interface that the user is interacting with, is rendering XHTML with CSS, etc. But dollars to donuts, those pages are being generated dynamically using one or more scripting and web application languages. PHP is a good example. Moreover, a typical web application is going to involve a back end or a rear tier that involves one or more relational database management systems for data storage. In the middle, between the presentation layer that the user's with and the back-end database that stores your data model, you have your actual application code. Now, PHP is a good example, but of course in this nugget we're learning how to apply our Python skills to a web application framework. Now, what I'm showing you over here, this N-tier or 3-tier architecture, is formally referred to as the MVC software architectural pattern. This stands for Model View Controller. It's a pretty popular architectural framework for web applications simply because it's so modular. It allows us as developers to do work on one component without interrupting the other components. So MVC, the V in the middle stands for view, and this is the user interface. It's going to be a web page in a web browser in this case. The M in MVC stands for model or data model, and that's almost always represented by your back-end relational database schema, how you've designed your tables, columns, constraints, etc. And then finally, the C in MVC stands for controller, and this is your middle-tier application logic that interfaces between the back-end database or your data model and your front-end view presented to the user. Now you'll notice that in this representative example of 5 popular Python web application frameworks, at least 2 openly subscribe to the MVC pattern. Really, all of them do to a greater or lesser degree. If you go out onto the web and do a search for Python web application frameworks, I'm actually going to show you that list in just a moment, you'll find there's a lot to choose from. I hope that I'm helping you cut down on your research and helping you to separate the wheat from the chaff by giving you these 5. These are very, very popular Python web app frameworks. First one I'd like to mention is called Django. If you're familiar with the gypsy jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt, that's where this product gets its name. All of these are open source tools, by the way, completely free. Django is a MVC-based web application framework where its architectural principle is dry, or don't repeat yourself. Pylons is another Python web application framework. This is influenced by Ruby on Rails, ROR. You've probably heard of this if you're just getting into development. Certainly if you have experience as a software or web developer, you're familiar with it. There's the Ruby programming language, and then Ruby on Rails is the web app framework that surrounds that language. Pylons is a similar idea where Python is the back-end programming language, or should we say middle-tier programming language, and it has web server and web presentation functionality built in. TurboGears, MVC, it features rapid development. Web to Py was originally designed as a teaching tool, supports agile development. As you get more experienced with software developments and design patterns, you're also going to probably want to take a look at agile software development. It's a really nice methodology for very quickly and accurately working your way through a software development product in a team environment. And then finally we have Zope. Zope's been around for a while. probably because of its maturity. Some consider this to be Python's killer app that really put Python into the so-called spotlight. Guido van Rossum himself worked with the Zope team until 2003. I'm now going to take you on a brief tour of each of those 5 web framework websites and then show you a representative example of a site that was built by using that framework. First, we have Django. The URL for the site is djangoproject.com. We can trust that the site itself was built using Django, and it works pretty well. If we go back to the home page, I kind of like this. It says that Django is the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. A high-profile site that is built using the Django framework is the WashingtonPost.com. Pretty impressive when you think of that. This is a major news site. Next framework we're going to take a look at is Pylons. Pylons is at pylonshq.com for pylonsheadquarters.com. Their advertising slogan is, and again, this is open source, free, so the advertising is just really to generate buzz in users. Pylon combines the very best ideas from Ruby, Python, and Perl, providing a structured but extremely flexible Python web framework. Out of the box, Pylons aims to make web development fast, flexible, and easy. You'll also notice advertisements on each of these project pages for books that are focused on that subject. I've read quite a few A-Press titles on Python and related technologies. They tend to be pretty good. A high-profile example of a Pylons built site is the original BitTorrent.com website. Next, let's go over to the TurboGears homepage. This is at turbogears.org. Looks like a news site. As of this recording in May 2010, it looks like TurboGears 2 is the current version. Frankly, I didn't find many heavy hitter websites based on TurboGears. At least it wasn't obvious in my Google searching, and I do consider myself to have pretty good Google foo. This is a representative site though, newmetalarmy.com. It's obviously a video gaming or it looks like heavy metal music oriented site. You know, it does what it's supposed to do. When you think about a web framework, at least when I think of a web framework, I'm thinking of standard compliant code, usability on the back end, and certainly usability from the user's perspective. Now let's have a look at Web2Py. They define this as a free and open source full-stack enterprise framework for agile development of fast, scalable, secure, and portable database-driven web-based apps written and programmable in Python. No big surprise there. Again, there's an advertisement for a book on the home page. Again, I didn't find too many big ticket sites like Washington Post using Web2Py, but that certainly doesn't mean that there are not any. This is sitescraper.net. Pretty simple, elegant site. Does what it's supposed to do, as I said earlier. And then finally, let's take a look at Zope. The Zope project homepage is zope.org. This is a very richly detailed site in terms of information. Look at the sidebar links. Look at all of these links that you can browse for. Wow. Zope, like Django, tends to be the highest profile in terms of attach rate. There's some pretty big organizations that have built their web portals based on Zope. This is the AARP organization. And finally, for additional information on Model View Controller, I would recommend Wikipedia. As you know by now, if you've taken other courses by me with CBT Nuggets, I'm a big fan of Wiki. Their Model View Controller article is pretty good. It's not the best, but it's still a really good starting point for understanding how this software architecture works. I also wanted to show you a couple screenshots of the administrative website for Django and Zope in particular. There's not a whole lot to see. As you see, the Django administration site is pretty darn elegant, and that's really the point. A lot of CBT Nuggets customers come from a Microsoft background, so perhaps you're used to the SharePoint server interface, which is quite cluttered indeed. SharePoint is the same basic idea as these Python-based web application frameworks, although SharePoint uses Microsoft SQL Server, of course, as its backend, and uses ASP.NET, that's Microsoft's competitor to PHP, as its application logic and presentation language. I also have a screenshot I found of Zope, again a very simple, elegant interface, and that's about all there is to it. Now let's shift our attention to Python Integrated Development Environments, or IDEs. Of course, we've been doing most of our work in this series thus far in an IDE. Of course, we've been using IDLE, which does have some of these features you see in this list that I pulled from a really nifty article on StackOverflow.com. When we're looking for an IDE, we're looking for something that's obviously going to support our language. The Microsoft Visual Studio application IDE is not going to get us very far. In fact, it's not going to get us anywhere with regard to Python. Of course, if we're using IronPython or Jython, there are IDEs for those environments. This is a list of features, IDE features, that the professional programmers at Stack Overflow thought were useful for comparative purposes. Is the IDE cross-platform? Does it run natively on Windows, Mac OS X, Linux? Is it commercial or free? Do we have code completion? Do we have localization with language? Do we have a debugging environment that's integrated into the IDE? Can we mark up errors and exceptions? Is there source control integration? As you develop more experience with programming, especially once you join a development team, you're absolutely going to be using version control software. A popular one is Subversion, which is often abbreviated to SVN. These are code repositories that are nothing more than a safe place for code to be, such that developers can check out and check back in modules, and it keeps track of changes, so there's revision tracking, and also, even more importantly, prevents your code from getting stepped on against somebody maybe overwriting code that you've just put in, or two folks trying to access the same file at the same time, etc. Smart indentation is useful, such that depending upon what you're doing, like in idle, for instance, if we open up a header line with a colon and then press enter, you get the 4-tab indent. Of course, indentation is crucial in Python, so this is a really must-have feature for us. Bracket matching isn't so useful in Python, but it is for a language like C#, any of the C languages that use braces to denote the beginning and end of routines. Line numbers I find to be particularly important, and one of idle's biggest weakness, the fact that idle doesn't number lines. When you're sharing codes with your colleagues, you definitely want to be able to reference line numbers in your code. UML is a markup language that we can use to design interfaces, design relational databases, design software systems. It's a modeling language, actually. Visio, for instance, the Microsoft Visio application, has built-in UML templates. Again, as you get out into the industry and start working as a software developer, you doubtless will begin using UML. Code folding means that you can expand or collapse sections of your code. As your Python script file gets more complex, you'll find that code folding can really simplify your view. Code templates is exactly what you think, a nice way to reuse code and just open up boilerplate script files that already have your header and your generic document strings placed, etc. Does the IDE have built-in unit testing? Testing is a very important, crucial phase of software development that as a topic is beyond our scope in this course, but if your IDE does have built-in debugging and unit testing capabilities, all to the good. Is there an integrated GUI designer? We've already talked about Qt. Eric is another GUI platform. We learned a bunch of them, actually. As you saw from our demo with tkinter, it's not the most fun you'll ever have in the world building graphical user interfaces manually with code. It's much, much easier to use a graphical builder, in my opinion. Do we have seamless integration with databases? If we're working with Python frameworks, chances are you're looking at a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL, but you also could just as well be plugging into some of the big commercial systems like Oracle, IBM DB2, and Microsoft SQL Server 2008. And then finally, does the IDE support what's called rapid application development? Again, when we're trying to pick out representative examples of web application frameworks, and now IDEs, it involves quite a bit of research, but ultimately this is a selective process. What I finally narrowed the list down to are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of what I and a lot of other Python programmers in the world feel are the best IDEs available for Python for one reason or another. You'll notice that 2 of these are commercial and they cost actually a fair bit of money. ActiveState, who as we know publishes their own distribution of Python, has an excellent IDE called Komodo. Their Komodo Edit is a smaller free version of their IDE. The enterprise version is called Komodo IDE, and that does cost. The other one that costs, but in my opinion it's really worth it if you're going to get into Python development in depth, is from Wingware. Their Wing IDE Pro is especially suited for learners, in my opinion. They have a lot of really useful code lookup utilities built into the IDE that makes understanding the connection, for instance, between imported libraries and your top-level module file a lot easier to visualize. Another extremely popular IDE is Eclipse. Now, Eclipse is a language-neutral framework. That is to say, Eclipse is an IDE host or shell into which you can plug in your development environment of choice. Therefore, if we're going to use Eclipse with Python development, we're going to need to download Eclipse. Technically, you just need the much smaller Eclipse runtime environment. I have installed the entire thing on my system. And then from Eclipse, you can download and install what's called the PyDev plugin. This gives you Python support in the Eclipse IDE. NetBeans is another platform-neutral IDE written in Java that does support Python among many other languages. I frankly prefer NetBeans to Eclipse. Eclipse I find to be very complex. I hope that if you're in an environment where you're programming using Eclipse, that you have some really good teachers to show you the ropes, because it's not easy. Finally, to finish out this list, Boa Constructor is perhaps the most popular GUI builder. This one uses WX Python framework, which we learned about in the GUI nugget in this series. Now, Visual tkinter, as I mentioned, not in a spoken way, but I gave you one of my little annotation bubbles in the GUI nugget. Visual tkinter is a wonderful idea. I just wish that it weren't so buggy and that it actually worked. Finally, there's Stanny's Python editor, free, open source, SPE as it's known. A lot of folks are really big fans of it. Now let me show you some of these tools in action. I'm not going to give you the URLs of all of those IDEs. Quite honestly, you'd be just as well served opening up a Google search and looking for those names. However, before I show you some of these GUIs in action, I wanted to bring you out onto the web just for a moment to show you the Boa Constructor site, boaconstructor.sourceforge.net. If you're not familiar with sourceforge.net, this is a very popular, long-standing, community-driven website where you can host your software development products. In particular, these are open source, free software development products and projects. Therefore, if you're not familiar with SourceForge, make sure you get familiar, because dollars to donuts, you'll be accessing SourceForge projects as modules perhaps or other add-ons to your Python. Boa Constructor, as we already said, is a GUI builder for Python, and I'm looking at their screenshots page where it gives us representative examples. Second place I want to show you is pythonide.blogspot.com. This, ironically enough, you don't think of a Blogger blog as being a project homepage, but it's where you can find Stanny's Python editor. And he advertises it, free Python IDE for Windows, Mac, and Linux with UML, PyChecker, debugger, GUI, design, Blender, and more. There's a lot to it. There really is. This is Eclipse with the PyDev plugin installed. Easy way you can see that PyDev is installed is that we have a PyDev menu item. As I said earlier, the Eclipse application has a pretty steep learning curve. It's not for the faint of heart. Once you get Eclipse downloaded and run for the first time, you don't have the PyDev available. So what you have to do is open up Help, come down to Install New Software, and similarly to how you work with software repositories in Linux, you have to add a repository for PyDev, and I pointed it to pydev.org/updates, and then you can select the PyDev for Eclipse add-on, and there's also PyDev Myelin integration. And once you do that, you then are able to create a new PyDev project with associated modules and so on. I don't believe I showed you Visual tkinter in our GUI nugget. I've downloaded it and installed it. It is such a great idea, friends. It's really wonderful. I mean, especially myself personally having experience with Visual Studio, I'm accustomed to this metaphor of the toolbox where you can literally just draw out your controls as you see here. And instead of worrying about pack and these other methods to align objects to your form, you can just drag and drop and use built-in alignment tools. Also, setting properties for those objects is just as easy as selecting the object and then coming over to the Properties window and making a change. In the actual code, you see that we have documentation already added. It gives you your imports right out of the box. It instantiates the form. You can change the window title right on the fly. And then as you add controls to the form, you'll notice that we get event handlers automatically created. Now, those of you who are familiar with Visual Studio are thinking, well, big deal. But in Python, something like this is a great luxury. This is Komodo Edit, ActiveState's free version of their Komodo IDE, and a motif that you see in most of these IDEs, which I think is a great idea, is you have a multi-window interface. We notice that we can ping-pong among more than one Python script file at once. Boy, does that help in development. And also another feature that these IDEs have is that you can run your script in an interpreter that's embedded right into the IDE, as you see here. I like Komodo Edit personally a heck of a lot more than Eclipse. And as I said earlier, these IDEs almost always are multi-language. So if we go to File, New File, you'll notice that we have lots and lots of templates. Of course, we're interested in the Python template, but as you see, we can build TK files, TCL, Ruby, Perl, HTML even, Django, C, C++, etc. It's a pretty robust and well-rounded IDE for sure. This is NetBeans. I also am a really big fan of NetBeans. This is a Java application. One thing that stands out to me about NetBeans is what you're seeing here with this little pop-up balloon. It's almost too easy to download updates for NetBeans and any plugins or extensions that you have into the IDE. That it's almost too easy to keep everything up to date. It's really cool. Those of you who are programmers or systems administrators who don't like to just download updates, you might want to go into Options or your Plugins area and modify those settings. But definitely NetBeans out of the box wants to keep itself up to date. And we have a built-in environment here where we can run our code, as you see here. And if we go to create a new file, you'll see in the Python template list, we can create a Python executable module, a standard module, empty module, a Python package. We remember what packages are earlier in the course, and you can even create unit testing. So NetBeans is a good example of a well-rounded Python IDE that even includes testing built into it. Excellent, excellent platform. I love NetBeans. And last but not least, we have WingWare Wing IDE, the Python IDE. At first blush, you're probably thinking to yourself, whoa, there's a lot going on this screen. And that's true, but, and this is a big but, the main reason why I would recommend Wing IDE for you as a new student to Python above all the others is just how heavily and nicely documented Wing IDE is. For instance, you notice on your screen here I have the tutorial up that's walking us through configuring the environment, of which there's some work to do for sure. But if something goes wrong, you have remediation links. So in this part of the tutorial, we can make sure that we have our installed Python hooked in with the integrated development environment, you see. And again, you see down below, it's kind of difficult with my screen resolution set the way it is. We have a full-fledged interpreter. This is exactly what we would see if we ran Python from the command line. And as you see, we get our code help, our auto-completion, etc., and so on. Wing IDE, it's going to cost you some money to purchase a license, but in my opinion, it's very worth it. Python Frameworks and IDEs Review. In this nugget, we looked at a representative selection of Python web application frameworks. Therefore, this nugget, in combination with the one we did on GUI desktop development, ought to give you a great head start in learning to apply your newfound Python programming skills to real-world Python-based solutions. We then looked at IDEs, which for some programmers make life a lot easier, and I gave you again a smattering of what I consider to be the most popular of those IDEs, and I provided you with a little tour. Well, friends, we've reached the end of the road. It's been an absolute privilege and a joy being your guide and instructor through this series. I certainly hope that you enjoyed it. Please feel free to contact me by the given email address with any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, curiosities. I love interacting with my students. Thanks for purchasing this product. Thanks for hanging in there with me. And I hope that this has been informative for you. And I'd like to thank you again for viewing. Take care.